I want to take you on a journey. A cinephilic journey. Through half a century of films, all made by the same filmmaker. It begins in the city where cinephilia itself began. One spring day in 1994, I crossed paths with Eric Rohmer. He was on location in Montmartre, shooting a film called Rendezvous in Paris. As I walked past, I glanced towards the camera. Behind the lens was a small group of people clustered around an old man with a red scarf. Their looks converged, not on me, but on a couple next to me. The couple to my right were actors. The old man to my left was Rohmer. I only realized this 14 years later, when I saw the film late one night on television. It was the first Rohmer film I'd ever seen. And I was in it. There I am. Why had I not seen a Rohmer film before? Something had to be done about it. So I began to watch his films. Within a few months, I'd seen all I could find. Cinephilia is an obsession waiting to be triggered. Rohmer had triggered it. As I began to watch his films a second and then a third time, I found myself drawn to his Paris films in particular. And as I followed his characters' journeys through the city, I also began to get a sense of Rohmer's own lifelong journey through it. So began my journey, a cinephilic journey through Rohmer's Paris. A journey made by making a film entirely out of footage from the films Rohmer shot in Paris. Looking back on it after 4 years, I can't help but wonder if cinephilia is a journey without end. But let's begin at the beginning, with a birth. Rohmer's birth as a filmmaker. Eric Rohmer was not born in Paris. He was also not born with the name Eric Rohmer. His birth name was Maurice Scherer. Sometime in the 1940s, Scherer moved to Paris and adopted his pseudonym. In a way then, Rohmer was born in Paris, or reborn in Paris as a cinephile. Within a few years, he'd become a film critic, and by the early 50s, he was writing for the now mythic film journal Cahiers du Cinéma. There he met many of the other cinephiles who would go on to form the Nouvelle Vague at the end of the decade, including François Truffaut, Jacques Rivette, Claude Chabrol, Jean-Luc Godard. Between them, these people invented cinephilia, or at least they invented the word. Soon, however, just watching films was not enough, so they began to make them too. Basing themselves in the Latin Quarter, they wrote, filmed, produced, and even appeared in each other's work. That's Godard at the record player. By the early 1960s, many of the Cahiers film critics had graduated to making feature films. Instead of filming in studios like the older generation of French filmmakers, they took their cameras out onto the streets. Shooting handheld, they caught urban life in mid-flow. Rohmer's first feature, The Sign of Leo, made in 1962, is typical Nouvelle Vague. It was shot in black and white, on a low budget, with a small crew, almost entirely on the streets of Paris. The film follows an extended journey on foot by an American immigrant, Pierre. He thinks he'll inherit a fortune. He's wrong. He spends all his money and becomes destitute. So begins his life walking the streets of Paris. And so began Rohmer's life filming them. The Sign of Leo is a bleak film. Rohmer never made another like it. Instead, he made comedies of manners. Just like the other Nouvelle Vague filmmakers, he followed his own path. But in one way at least, he always stayed faithful to the spirit of the Nouvelle Vague. Throughout his life, Rohmer didn't just film Paris, he documented it.
Paris, le carrefour Villiers. À l'est, le boulevard des Batignolles. Au nord, la rue de Lévis et son marché. Le café, le dôme de Villiers. À sa gauche, l'avenue de Villiers. Le métro Villiers. À l'ouest, le boulevard de Courcelles. Il conduit au parc Monceau, tout près duquel un chantier de démolition
Modern Paris, Rohmer's Paris, is a 19th century creation. Between the 1850s and 1860s, much of the city centre was demolished and rebuilt by Baron Georges Eugène Haussmann, prefect of the Seine. Haussmann tore through the city's old slums to create a new map of Paris. A map based on long straight boulevards, designed to encourage movement through the city. Haussmann's boulevards featured a crucial innovation: pavements. Lined with trees and benches, they turned walking into a leisure activity. Parisians window shopped in the new stores that appeared on Haussmann's new boulevards. They stopped off in cafes. They wandered through Haussmann's new gardens and parks.
Je sais que ces rivières sont artificielles, que ces roches sont du ciment, mais ça n'a pas d'importance.
Rohmer was a walker, and so were his characters.
J'aime flâner dans les vieilles rues de la rive gauche, pleines de boutiques d'antiquaires et de librairies.
Flâner, to stroll. Historically, the flaneur forms a part of urban life, but also observes it from a distance. Rohmer's characters are flaneurs, but their walks are restricted to lunch hours and evenings out. They form detours from less leisurely trajectories, the lines of a daily commute. Rohmer traces every step of his characters' journeys through the city with topographic precision. His characters follow actual paths through Paris, paths that can be drawn as lines on the city's map. The journey you are now watching, for example, in The Aviator's Wife, follows one such route, from the Gare de l'Est to the Butte Chaumont, one of Haussmann's new parks. I'm going to let this sequence play for a while, just as it does in the film. Of course, as they journey through the city, Rohmer's characters cross paths with one another. Their movements become part of a network of lines. This is Francois. A few mornings ago, he saw his girlfriend's ex-boyfriend exiting her flat. A few minutes ago, by chance, he saw the ex-boyfriend meeting another woman in the Gare de l'Est. Right now, he is following them. But in a few moments, Francois will make a new connection. Perhaps a romantic one. Perhaps this could be the start of something. Or perhaps not. Here's a similar sequence, but this time played for comedy.
Tu veux ma photo?
Rohmer's characters are always glancing at each other. On trains, on streets, in parks, in the two-way shop windows of cafes where they can see and be seen.
Me prends à regretter le temps qui n'est pas si lointain que je pouvais éprouver moi aussi. S'il y a une chose dont je suis incapable maintenant,
Each Rohmer film features a silent network of looks,
quand je vois des
overlaid on top of its geographic and social networks.
Je regarde là-haut. La manière dont marchent les gens, la manière dont ils regardent.
Rohmer's stories depend on these looks. Characters' paths may cross, but connections only come through looking and being looked back at. Without eye contact, there can be no social contact. Every day, in Rohmer's early short film The Girl at the Monsieur Bakery, a student walks past the object of his desire. A young woman called Sylvie. But she barely notices him.
Nous avions échangé quelques regards furtifs et nous en restions là.
As in film, so too in life. This is Nadia Tesic. In 1966, Rohmer made a short documentary about her life as a foreign student at the Cité Internationale Universitaire. Nadia drinks in cafes and meanders through the street like all Parisians do. Everywhere Nadia goes, like a Parisian, she glances. But, like the students, her glances go nowhere. Even old ladies don't return her look. So how do you direct? How do you take possession of someone else's look? Some of Rohmer's characters are much better at stealing a glance than others. In My Girlfriend's Boyfriend, a young bureaucrat, Blanche, makes a new friend, Leia, and comes to know Leia's boyfriend, Fabienne. Fabienne has a male friend, Alexandre. Blanche becomes obsessed by Alexandre, but Alexandre barely notices Blanche. So she pursues him. See how Blanche engineers a crossed path. She walks in a line across Fabienne's line of sight. What Rohmer is onto here, and was always into, is one of the basic truths about urban existence. In cities, humans' lives intersect every day, but most of these intersections are transitory, crossed paths between two people following different trajectories.
Vous allez à Paris?
Bah oui, tout à l'heure.
J'y vais, je peux vous conduire si vous voulez.
Bah, c'est-à-dire que je...
Vous avez votre voiture?
Oui, mais en fait, j'y vais par le train.
Eh ben, vous rentrerez par le train.
Oui, mais j'aurais voulu repasser chez moi avant, enfin...
Vous habitez loin?
À Saint-Christophe.
Et vous en avez pour longtemps?
Oh non, pas forcément.
Écoutez, je sens que je vous complique la vie. Je vous souhaite une bonne soirée. À bientôt.
Mais t'es vraiment nul.
The student in Rohmer's early short fares even worse. He manages to exchange occasional glances with Sylvie.
Nul doute qu'elle n'habitait dans le quartier. Nous l'avions aperçue une ou deux fois, un panier à la main, faisant ses courses. Je te rejoins. J'allais me décider à tenter le tout pour le tout, quand la chance enfin me sourit.
At one point, he even stumbles into her.
Là! Quoi? Là! Là! Comment? Oh, pardon.
Y a pas de mal.
Vraiment?
Nous ne sommes même pas cognés.
Heureusement. Je ne sais pas ce que j'ai aujourd'hui. Tout à l'heure, j'ai failli me casser la figure sur ces trucs-là.
Ah, j'aurais voulu voir ça.
J'ai dit j'ai failli. J'ai
Comment?
failli, il n'y a pas une malle. Oh, ces voitures, on n'entend rien.
Je vais par là.
Et moi par là. Je vous donne des dédommagements. Voulez-vous prendre le café avec nous ici dans une heure?
Je suis prise ce soir, une autre fois. Nous nous croisons souvent.
Oui, nous.
Au revoir, monsieur.
Au revoir, mademoiselle.
But the path to love is not a straight one.
3 jours, 8 jours passèrent, je ne la croisais plus.
Every lunchtime, the student retraces the route along which she passed Sylvie in the hope of meeting her again.
Mon seul moment libre était le repas. Je me passais donc de dîner. Ce dîner durant 30 minutes et mon aller et retour 3, mes chances de croiser Sylvie seraient ainsi multipliées par 10.
But it gets him nowhere. He tries a new strategy. He turns his wanderings back on themselves. He conjoins them into a loop. He circles the streets where he has previously sighted her.
Toutefois, ma recherche restait vaine. Des milliers de personnes habitaient le quartier.
But even a failed connection can start a butterfly effect. Blanche obsesses over Alexandra, but it too is a dead end. So instead, she becomes involved with Alexandra's best friend and Leia's boyfriend, Fabienne. Meanwhile, Leia, in turn, becomes involved with Alexandra. The film culminates in a scene in which both couples agree to meet at a secluded restaurant, so they won't cross paths with the other couple. A perfect location for a Rohmerian coincidence. A similar coincidence takes place in Rendezvous in Paris. In one of the film's 3 stories, a man and woman meet up in the various green spaces of Paris and discuss starting an adulterous relationship. Eventually, they agree to spend a weekend together at a hotel they passed on one of their walks, the Tim Hotel on Place Émile Goudeau. But as they approach the hotel, they discover that their partners have beaten them to it.
Ils entrent dans l'hôtel.
Tu es sûr que c'est lui?
Ou alors c'est une hallucination.
Écoute, réfléchissons. Tout est possible sauf une chose. Que dans les centaines d'hôtels qu'il y a à Paris, il ait choisi juste celui-ci.
Does this location seem familiar? It's the same street on which I crossed paths with Romer.
Mais c'est le bateau Lavoir?
Coincidentally, the woman I was with was also not my girlfriend. We too were starting an affair, and we too had decided to stay at Tim Hotel. Of course, we had no idea that at this moment we were in a Romer film. And in Romer's films, the less plausible a coincidence, the more certain it is to happen.
À Paris, les rendez-vous ne sont pas toujours pour vous. Il y a souvent des surprises, il y a parfois des méprises.
Romer's films are built around coincidence. Each film is a matrix of connections. But each film is also part of a larger matrix of connections, not within Romer's films, but between them and across them. The medieval monks illuminating Books of Hours in Notre Dame had a word for it: interlacement. Just as my path had interlaced with Romer's, so too his films interlace with each other. They coincide. Let's take a moment to see how this happens. Romer's films tend to focus either on Parisians working in Paris or Parisians on holiday in France. His early films follow characters moving on foot through the centre of Paris. This is the main character in Romer's short film Place de l'Étoile. Every day, he takes the same path to and from work. But we only see the last part of it, the part where he walks around the Arc de Triomphe. In the early 1970s, Romer began also to follow his characters' daily commutes between city and suburb. When planning these films, Romer would step into his characters' shoes and repeatedly take the same train journey that they took. From film to film, however, Romer almost never travelled the same route. Through each new commuter protagonist, in each new film, he journeyed to a new suburb.
plus sur quels critères j'appuyais mon jugement. Tout ne me fait pas suffisamment sortir. Et que je décelais au premier coup d'œil.
Also in the 1970s, Rohmer began to follow the SNCF's Grande Ligne to locations including Deauville, Normandy, Provence, Brittany. With each new holiday film, Rohmer used his camera stylo to trace new lines of movement. Over the course of his 50-year filmmaking career, Rohmer superimposed lines onto lines. His filmic map became more complex and extended ever further. It's always a relief to get out of the city, so let's take a short break. This is Delphine. The film is The Green Ray. Delphine has 2 weeks of vacation to film. She can't decide how to spend it, so she takes 3 abortive journeys to 3 different holiday destinations: Biarritz, Calais, and the Pyrenees. They all fail to satisfy her, and each time, within a few days, she's back in Paris. Her looping journeys from and to Paris are not just geographic, but, to use Guy Debord's famous phrase, psychogeographic. Characters react emotionally to spaces, and the way they react reveals their mental state, their psychogeography. For Delphine, as for almost every other character in the Rohmerian universe, Paris cannot be transcended.
On dit que je suis mondain. C'est pas vrai?
This is Octave. The film is Full Moon in Paris. Octave is a writer, a typical Rohmerian intellectual. As he sits in a cafe, eyeing the passers-by, he talks about his fear of the countryside and his amazement that other writers go there to work. Octave, by contrast, is addicted to Paris.
L'air est mauvais, mais je respire. Là-bas, l'air est bon, mais j'étouffe. J'ai besoin de me sentir au centre d'un pays, au centre d'une ville qui serait presque le centre du monde. Tu sais qu'à un moment, j'enseignais à Orléans. J'aurais pu très bien y trouver une chambre et tout, bon. Mais je préférais me taper 1 heure de train pour rentrer à Paris tous les soirs. Et pourquoi faire? Souvent, je lisais ou j'écoutais la radio. Je rentrais à Paris pour écouter la radio. Mais je savais que la rue existait, qu'il y avait les cinémas, les restaurants, les rencontres avec des femmes sublimes, les milliers de possibilités qu'exprimait la rue, c'était là, possible, en bas. J'avais qu'à descendre. Attends, il y a un truc que j'aimerais noter parce que je trouve ça pas mal. Mais ça n'a absolument aucun rapport avec ce qu'on était en train de dire. Mais ça me plaît. 1 seconde, hein.
Eh ben, prends ton temps. J'arrive.
It could be any Rohmer character saying this. They all speak the same words. Rohmer's words. One can picture Rohmer himself rhapsodizing about Paris in a similar café.
Nul doute qu'elle n'habita dans le quartier.
Rohmer's first cinematic journey through the streets of Paris takes place in a short comedy that he made with Godard in 1959.
Je vous prenais pour une Française. Si, si. Do you speak English? Ah, suédoise. Jagelskardig? Ça veut dire je vous aime, oui. Je vais un peu vite, mais c'est tout ce que je sais. Norvégienne? Finlandaise? Allemande, oui. Deutsche Sprach? Non, pas espagnole. Japonaise. Mizuguchi Kurosawa?
The film is Charlotte and Veronique, or All the Boys Are Called Patrick, and it was shot in the Luxembourg Gardens and on the streets around the Sorbonne. Rohmer would return to this area in at least 8 more films. Rohmer's lifelong journey was a round trip, an aller-retour, from and to the Latin Quarter. It culminated in the last film he shot on location, Rendezvous in Paris, the film in which I appeared. One of the gardens that the almost adulterous couple visits is the Luxembourg Gardens. At one point, for a few seconds, they cross paths, almost 40 years apart, with 2 of the characters in Charlotte and Veronique. Here, at Place Edmond Rostand, the epicenter of the Latin Quarter. And of Rohmer's Paris.
Et si elle se trouve habitée en plein
Why the Latin Quarter? Rohmer's production company was based here for many years, so it was an easy place to film. But perhaps there's a deeper reason for his return here. A psychogeographic reason. This is my interpretation. The Latin Quarter was where it all started for Rohmer. Maurice Scherer was born in a small town in central France. Éric Rohmer was born in the Latin Quarter. It was in the Latin Quarter that Scherer rebirthed himself as a cinephile in the late 1940s, back when it was still a haunt of artists and bohemians. The Latin Quarter is where the Cahiers du Cinéma critics met after work, in cafes with overarching names like the Dôme, the Pergola, and the Coupole.
On vient là pour parler.
It was where they went to watch films, and it was where they themselves began to make films. The Nouvelle Vague gestated and birthed itself on these streets. And, in some ways, Rohmer was never quite able to move on. Always when giving interviews, at some point Rohmer returns to the Nouvelle Vague, obsessively replaying his memory of it. In these moments, Rohmer the filmmaker once again becomes Rohmer the cinephile, nostalgically looking back to a time and place when his filmmaking was part of something bigger. Cicero writes of a child of Saguntum, a baby who looked out of its mother's womb when it was born, did not like what it saw, and climbed back in. The Latin Quarter was Rohmer's creative womb, and he never escaped it. Rohmer was haunted by the Nouvelle Vague. What most haunts me is Nadia's face. Though she doesn't realise it, she's also a Rohmer character. Eloquent, socialised, but alone. It seems as if she has an active social life, but there's something not quite right here. Is she, perhaps, just performing her carefree Parisian lifestyle for the camera? Look at her friends. They're all older than her, and male. There's a forced familiarity. I would wager that these people are Rohmer's friends, not hers. It seems like they're having a lively conversation, but notice her face when she stops speaking. See the sadness in it. Nadia is not a professional actor. She doesn't realise that if she's performing a role, she also has to act when she's not speaking. I wonder what happened to her. I hope she found what she was looking for. But what exactly are Rohmer's characters looking for? They're looking for love, of course. They want something more than just the fleeting, but sometimes thrilling moments at which two people's paths cross. Instead, they want to find that special point where their path through life meets another human being's and becomes beautifully entwined with it, conjoined with it. They want their journeys through the city to reach their destination at the end of the day in the eyes of a lover. Strangers glance at each other and break eye contact immediately. Friends exchange looks for maybe a few seconds at a time. Only lovers hold each other's gaze indefinitely. Rohmer's characters want someone into whose eyes they can look for the rest of their lives. Rohmer's films follow characters on a journey. Regardless of where they go, within Paris or beyond, their destination is always the same: the object of their love. Rohmer's destination was his starting point, the Latin Quarter. Gradually, over the course of making this film, I discovered mine. My destination was Éric Rohmer. I was not just making this film about him, I was making it for him. Cinephiles watch films again and again. We spend time with them, get to know them, grow to love them. And as we love the film, we love the filmmaker. The two are inseparable. I wanted Rohmer to feel this love. I wanted him to stop looping back to the Nouvelle Vague, and instead to feel part of a cinephilic lineage that will continue forever. I wanted him to see my film, to be watching and listening as I said this to him. Éric Rohmer, I love you. About 6 months after I started work on this film, at the age of 89, Rohmer died. Loin, bien loin, profanes esprits.
esprit, qui naît d'un saint amour épris, en ce lieu saint ne fasse entrer. Voici le bois où chaque jour.
His final film was The Romance of Astrea and Celadon, released in 2008. It's a lovely film, a love letter to life from someone who is soon to leave it. At the same time, among Rohmer's films, it's anomalous. It's set in the distant past, in an imaginary place. Watching it a few weeks after Rohmer's death, I couldn't help but wish that he'd made his final film in Paris. This is how I imagined it. Rohmer has returned to film Paris one more time. One day, I watch him at work behind the camera, but this time not by chance. Rohmer has seen my film and allowed me to film him on location. The day ends in the Latin Quarter, where Rohmer still lives after all these years. He's weak and can no longer walk, so I wheel him around his favourite locations. As we part, just for a moment, he looks straight at me and smiles. My film has touched him, and he is grateful. In that moment, as the camera's eye witnesses our eye contact, I too become part of the endless cinephilic line. Of course, this was always just a dream. The connections we most want almost never happen. In A Winter's Tale, a hairdresser called Félicie meets a man on holiday and becomes pregnant with his child. But she writes down his address wrongly and they lose touch. Still, she continues loving him, year after year. Every day, Félicie imagines she sees him on the streets of Paris and sets off in pursuit. Precisely because she never finds him, Félicie's love is never challenged, and so never falters. Cinephilia is also an unfaltering love. Cinephiles watch films again and again. Yet for all the hours that we spend watching our beloved filmmakers' creations, our look is never returned. Cinephilia is perverse. It's a one-way love, a love that cannot be reciprocated. A film by a favourite director may offer an illusion of companionship, even intimacy, but as soon as it's over, we are on our own again. Cinephilia is futile. That's what makes it one of the purest forms of love there is. Of course, when love is not reciprocated, it can lead to obsession. Rohmer was dead, and all I had were his films. So I watched them, again and again, until I'd collected and catalogued all the shots of Paris that Rohmer ever filmed. For example,
juste au-dessus,
hotels,
dont la clientèle n'est plus faite que d'hôtes de passage et de touristes.
Characters entering doorways. Characters exiting doorways. Characters entering the metro. Characters exiting the metro. Trains, interior. Trains, exterior. Characters walking through train stations. Characters walking through markets. Characters talking on the phone. Characters talking in cafes. Characters on the phone in cafes. I have about 1,000 clips in total. I realise this may seem a little obsessive, but it was not just my own obsession that made me scrutinise and collect all these shots. It was Rohmer's too. I was simply repeating Rohmer's own repetitions.
Les colonnes doriques et les frontons Louis XIII attestent la timidité du constructeur.
I've often heard it said that once you've seen one Rohmer film, you've seen them all. But perhaps that's the point. Rohmer's films repeat themselves because all lives repeat themselves. The daily repetition of our movement between home and work, for example, is itself reflected millions of times in the movements of other commuters. And yet each person's movements are slightly different. It is these differences that together form our individual trajectories through life. Listen, for example, to the different ways in which people climb stairs. Rohmer once said that he looked for diversity in unity. For there to be difference, there must be sameness. Rohmer formalised his obsession with sameness and difference by making films in cycles. The moral tales, the comedies and proverbs, the tales of the four seasons. Each film in each cycle plays out a variation on a theme. Rohmer once suggested that his 6 moral tales were, in a sense, each part of the same film. Perhaps all his films are, in a sense, just one film. Rather than making the same film again and again, was Rohmer in fact making the same film all along? Perhaps we have not yet appreciated the full complexity of Rohmer's work because we have only ever seen it in 90-minute fragments. Perhaps we could only fully appreciate Rohmer's films if we were to see them cut together into a single film. A film lasting 60 hours, in which every ending is just another beginning. Or perhaps a film lasting 600 or 6,000 hours, in which every connection that could be made between every character that Rohmer ever created would be made. Perhaps I am the person to make this film. It would take a lifetime to make, just as Rohmer's films took a lifetime to make, but I would gladly do it. James Joyce wanted Finnegan's Wake printed as one line of text running around the globe. No beginning, no middle, no end. I imagine Rohmer's life's work as a 60-hour sequence playing in an endless loop, its own world on its own circular orbit. And I imagine myself in a dark space at the centre of its orbit, endlessly playing and replaying it, copying and pasting, cutting and recutting it until I die. In that space, perhaps I may at last know what happiness is. And at last I too shall return to the womb.
Gérite, il est mort! Venez tous chez moi, tous! Venez chez moi, tous! Venez!
How to end a film? For Rohmer, the answer is simple. Engineer a chance connection. In The Sign of Leo, just as Pierre hits rock bottom, a friend sees him and picks him up out of a gutter. Apparently, he has just inherited a fortune after all. In A Winter's Tale, Félicie exchanges glances with a stranger and discovers that for once it's not a stranger.
Assieds-toi bien.
Félicie.
Il part.
In The Girl at the Monsieur Bakery, as soon as the narrator stops looking for Sylvie, she spots him.
Bonjour. Tiens, bonjour.
Within 60 seconds, Rohmer has married them off.
Vous êtes blessé?
La pluie, vous n'en trouverez pas, je peux très bien marcher.
Vraiment?
Rohmer ties up his loose ends with an almost Shakespearean insouciance.
La rue était déserte. Et la boulangère, si elle
For
sortait,
Rohmer,
pouvait nous apercevoir.
all endings are just another
De toute façon,
beginning,
pensais-je
a
lâchement,
point
il
on a
sera trop loin
circle.
pour qu'il y ait un drame. Je n'osais me retourner et ce parcours fut interminable. Nous aperçut-elle,
So how to end my film?
à m'attendre, je n'en saurais jamais rien.
A few weeks ago, the answer finally came to me. I'd always imagined ending my journey on the left bank. So that's what I did. I returned to Paris and made a tour of Romaire's locations. It felt wrong to step out of Romaire's Paris into the actual city, like I was breaking the basic logic of my film, of looking only at Romaire's Paris and using only images from his films. But I've already included a few shots from other films along the way. I make my rules, so I can break them. Besides, there was no other way to end my film. I'd been in Romaire's Paris for too long. It was time to let my obsession go. Time to leave. So here I am. Today, I finally visited Romaire. "18 years ago, without my knowing it, Romaire put me in his film. And now, without his knowing it, I've put him in mine. I've made my connection. But it's still not quite what I was hoping for. Since that day in Montmartre, I've been around the world. And now I find myself in Paris again. Once again looking in Romaire's direction. And once again, he does not return my look. Will I stop loving him because of this? Of course not.